Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a country that, well, despite its size, holds a surprisingly significant place in the story of Latin America, Uruguay.
It really does. When you look at the source material you've shared, it reveals a history that's not just a footnote to its larger neighbors, Argentina and Brazil, but a really compelling case study in itself.
And what immediately jumps out from the introduction is this idea of deep paradoxes, right? Woven right into Uruguay's past.
Hmm?
Think about it. A country that started almost as a feudal backwater, dominated by just a few powerful people, somehow evolved into a nation known for maintaining robust democracy and championing equality. That's quite a journey.
It absolutely is a remarkable transformation.
Yeah.
So our mission here is to sift through this source material, pull out those crucial insights, and understand how this country navigated such contradictory forces to become what it is today.
Right.
And the material frames this journey using what it calls 3 illuminating chapters or concepts, and that's pretty much how we'll explore it.
Perfect. Let's jump straight into that first chapter then. The foundations and the early conflicts. Where does the story begin?
It starts, like many in the Americas, before European arrival. The territory was home to distinct indigenous groups. You had the Shirua, often described as hunter-gatherers.
Although the source cautions about that term, right? Not to oversimplify.
Exactly, a good point.
Yeah.
Then you had the Guarani, who were agriculturalists, and they actually traded with the Shirua. And up north, the Shane, more focused on fishing, hunting, and gathering.
And there's a lot of rich archaeology from this time, but it seems the actual historical records left behind by Europeans are, well, pretty limited when it comes to understanding these early societies on their own terms.
Precisely. And then, of course, the Europeans arrive. The Portuguese spot the coastline first, 1512. But it's the Spanish who make the early settlement attempts.
I love this little detail from the source about Caboto's expedition in 1526 down to the Rio de la Plata. Apparently, they nicknamed him El Rey de los Peces, the king of fish.
Yeah. Because of the incredible amount of seafood they found.
Quite a contrast to the actual difficulties they faced trying to settle, though.
Absolutely. That initial attempt to establish San Rey de Buenos Aires in 1536. It failed fast, abandoned by 1537. Indigenous resistance was strong.
So the Spanish made other tries?
They did, but eventually their colonization efforts in the whole Rio de la Plata region really relied quite heavily on help coming down from Paraguay.
And there was this early push for conversion, too, wasn't there?
Yes. The material notes they found more success with the Guarani. Their languages were described as softest and most mellifluous, apparently easier to work with compared to the challenges they faced with the, quote, primitive gaucho. And this era really paints a picture of the Spanish court just not seeing this territory as a priority. The source uses a very telling phrase, abandonada por la corte como una arroba algo lentísima.
Basically calling it a second-rate colony.
Pretty much. Their focus was less on building up the colony itself and more on extracting wealth, sometimes from others, often through trade further east with Brazil.
So you get these early kind of scattered attempts at Presence Solis back in 1516, Mendoza's failed attempts in 36, Cabeza de Vaca's later exploration, which the source calls the first modern one.
Yes, and even some longer-lasting points of presence, like the Portuguese colony of Santan, established in 1567, and earlier points like the Santos Mendes encampment.
And the Jesuits. They were influential for a while.
They were, yeah. Even used Guarani as a kind of lingua franca, a common language. But then, eventually, they were expelled from all Spanish territories.
It seems the territory that would become Uruguay, the Banda Oriental, was really seen as, well, undesirable. The source quotes it being stigmatized as the most inhospitable and forsaken land on the face of the earth.
Wow, forsaken. Despite that, colonization efforts did continue, fueled by that classic drive for glory and wealth.
Which involved conversions.
Conversions, yes, but also some brutal actions. The source mentions Jesuits and Spanish soldiers burning native villages.
And this brings us to a really tragic point, the source highlights. You might hope that independence, when it came, would lead to some kind of integration for indigenous peoples. But the reality was very different. A history of progressive exclusion.
It culminated horrifically in what the source explicitly describes as the indigenous genocide of Arroyo Salso Puedes in 1833.
That was carried out by the army of the new state?
Yes, the army of the young Uruguayan state, reportedly responding to demands from Brazilian ranchers, estancieros, who wanted more security.
And the survivors.
The few survivors were essentially pushed into the rural labor force, becoming rural proletariat. They basically vanished as a distinct sovereign group from the historical record.
And on top of that tragedy, when those missionary towns were lost to Brazil in 1829, it meant the forced transfer of Guarani populations, leading to real deep poverty for them.
It's a crucial point. While strong European immigration in the mid-19th century later helped lay the groundwork for a welfare state, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
It happened within a land ownership structure that was still largely feudal. The source really emphasizes how that indigenous identity, being Indian, just lost traction. It was actively excluded from the national founding narratives.
So the push for independence wasn't purely an internal spark then. It was significantly influenced by external tremors.
Definitely. The American and French revolutions, the new constitutional government back in Cadiz, Spain, and Napoleon, detaining the Spanish king Ferdinand VII in 1808.
Those events certainly fanned anti-colonial feelings, right? Yeah. And created openings for a break with Spain.
They did. But the source adds a nuance. This external influence also made the independence movement vulnerable to accusations of, being manipulated from abroad.
I see.
And independence here wasn't like a sudden overthrow. It was generally a voluntary, decade-long emancipation process tied into the wider movement across the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata.
So it had local drivers, but outside ideas were important.
Yeah, particularly American revolutionary ideas, especially after 1810. The source suggests they were a stronger influence in terms of constitutional thinking.
And this whole period turns the Banda Oriental into what the source calls a theater of tensions.
Exactly. There's even that fascinating detail about a manifesto from Montevideo in October 1810 asking to be considered one of the rebel provinces of North America.
Wow, quite a statement.
That 10-year stretch, the Artigas era, from 1810 to 1820, is seen as absolutely foundational for understanding the political culture and the debates over what kind of country they actually wanted to build.
Okay, so the framework for the Republic starts to take shape with the Constitution of 1826, setting core principles, the executive's role and codes.
But the real landmark document is the 1830 Constitution, signed on July 18th. It was drafted by an assembly elected only by propertied citizens, mind you, and it set up a unitary Republican representative system. Separation of powers, the works.
You might think, with inspiration from revolutionary France and America, this constitution would challenge the old guard, the status quo.
You might think that, but the source makes it very clear. It didn't fundamentally shake the dominance of the big landowners and merchants.
And that had lasting consequences.
Huge consequences. Restrictions on who could vote, weak political parties, narrow legal interpretations, sometimes even authoritarian tactics. It all meant that a few ruling families held significant sway.
For a long time.
Yeah, sometimes effectively unchallenged in presidential elections by the late 1880s, right up until the 1950s.
So this republic wasn't born into peace and quiet. Its early decades, say in 1814 to 1852, were marked by intense struggles and civil wars.
Yes, fundamentally between two main ideas. Unitarianism, pushing for a strong central government, often looking towards Buenos Aires for leadership, maybe hegemony.
Versus federalism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Advocating for a more decentralized union of republics. And the source rightly points out that Uruguay's political fate was constantly being shaped by forces beyond its borders, particularly those ongoing rivalries between Argentina and Brazil. They both saw the Banda Oriental as this crucial buffer zone, or maybe even a prize.
That struggle immediately spills over into the second major theme you mentioned, building and challenging the modern state. And the challenging starts right away with more civil war.
Right. The rivalry between the Blanco Party, kind of linked to Artigas's legacy, and the Colorado Party, led by figures like Rivera, just ignited conflicts. The most significant period here is the Guerra Grande, the Great War, from 1839 to 1851.
And the source frames the Guerra Grande as having this huge geopolitical backdrop. It wasn't just an internal squabble.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It fundamentally shifted Uruguay's position. From being potentially just part of the United Provinces, it established its status as a neutral state, though a fragile one. And Montevideo's strategic port was absolutely key to this.
The initial spark, as you said, was that core divide. Centralized versus decentralized power. Unitarios versus federales.
Yes, and the Spanish material adds interesting texture here, noting how the name Guerra Grande initially just reflected the sheer scale of the conflict across the territory. It was massive.
We see these key events like the Blanco takeover of Montevideo in 1839, then Rivera's countermoves, and a political shift in 1843 that really escalated the fighting.
Yeah, and there was that long, brutal siege of Montevideo marked by famine, disease. Later events like the Battle of Caseros also played a role in the outcome.
What's really insightful, I think, is how the source describes the consequences of this prolonged civil war. It says this conflict is essential for understanding the country's often contradictory character.
It really is. On one hand, it forged a kind of national affirmation, this urgent sense of nationalism, a shared identity emerging from facing external pressures and deep internal division.
But at the same time, the source notes it created internal recello and social discord with extreme polarization. Deep mistrust, deep division. Things official histories sometimes tend to gloss over.
And the material is quite specific here. It states this wasn't a class war, not really. It was a conflict born of causes irreconcilable and of high continuity.
Fought with nasty methods.
Yeah, methods like intrigue, ambushes, and poisons, suggesting it wasn't exactly a straightforward clash between honest factions.
Ultimately, the Colorados gained dominance by 1865. The source initially associates them with progressive ideas, science, literature, respect for humanitarianism.
True, but it also notes that later on, they seem to lack illuminating vision, which then allowed the Blue Party, another term for the Blancos, to gain ground again.
Okay, so that period of intense civil strife was followed by a time of relative calm, starting around 1875.
Relative calm, yes. This saw real improvements in governance, increased state revenues, and significant public works projects. We're talking railways, telegraphs, irrigation systems, national education.
And these were explicitly aimed at attracting foreign money.
Absolutely, foreign financiers. But foreign policy remained really tricky. Uruguay struggled to stay truly neutral, caught between Argentina and Brazil.
There was even a diplomatic break with Argentina in 1877.
Yeah, Brazil was even caught supporting insurgents across the border at one point.
So this led to a period of isolation.
Pretty much. About 2 decades where Uruguay was quite isolated, especially after earlier attempts to lean on British support didn't really work out. Eventually, they found a more balanced approach, improving relations with other governments, carefully navigating their understanding with the U.S., and pursuing trade treaties with European nations.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and where the source identifies a major turning point. The age of Batllismo, kicking off around 1903. This wasn't just gradual progress, it was a real acceleration of liberal reforms between 1903 and 1914.
This is absolutely key. It marks a definite shift away from that classical liberalism focused mainly on economic growth towards what the source calls post-liberal theories.
Meaning?
Meaning more emphasis on social justice, on rights, on meeting people's actual needs, welfare, and this idea of collective utility.
And the context for this transformation was quite specific, wasn't it?
Very specific. You had an oligarchy dominated by the traditional grand old parties, the Blancos and Colorados. But you also saw the rise of a new social party, bringing in socialist and anarchist ideas.
Plus, the existing ruling parties had a near monopoly on the media.
Right. And the National University had recently been founded. All these elements were in play.
The central figure is José Batllismo Ordóñez.
Yes. The source describes him leading a movement explicitly against the upper classes, advocating for the masses. And, interestingly, drawing inspiration from the progressive liberalism models seen in places like Australia and New Zealand at the time.
And the sheer number of institutions created during this era is impressive. The source lists off things like the Public Health and Social Welfare Office, state insurance, a mortgage bank, the Labor Office, Civil Registry, Social Security, a Workers' Accidents Fund, public baths, state hospitals.
It's basically laying the foundation for a modern welfare state. It's huge.
And this era of reform coincided with incredible economic prosperity, didn't it?
It did. The material paints this picture of Uruguay, around 1870, as one of the richest economies per capita in the world, despite its small population, only about 343,000 people then.
Because they had massive surpluses of beef and wool?
Massive surpluses. Vast amounts of suitable land, and high-quality ranching techniques, many introduced by British immigrants.
This was the era of the first globalization, right? Roughly 1850 to 1914.
Exactly. Nearly 500,000 European settlers arrived before World War I. Uruguay was second only to Argentina in Latin America for foreign investment per capita, with the UK being the primary investor.
Also second in railway mileage per person.
Yeah. And get this. Beef and wool exports alone accounted for something like 94% of total exports by volume.
Wow. That really puts their economic position into sharp perspective. But the source notes this prosperity started to unravel after World War I, hit by the international wool crisis and then the onset of what would become the longest period of economic stagnation in Latin America, starting in the 1930s.
The impact was incredibly stark. GDP dropped by more than half between 1929 and 1933. Experts like live sheep and beef just saw a catastrophic collapse.
And the source explains why Uruguay was so vulnerable.
It all came down to wool. Its wealth was critically tied to the price of wool. So when that price plummeted globally in the late 20s, early 30s, it struck right at the core of their economy.
Initial policy responses didn't help much.
Not really. Things like cutting public spending, trying to prop up exports. They weren't effective in maintaining monetary stability, partly because they had a pegged fixed exchange rate. This actually contributed to a banking crisis.
Leading to the state having to step in.
Yes, the state had to intervene quite heavily in the financial system.
And this deep economic decline really undermined all that progress, the welfare system that had been built up during the Batllismo era.
It absolutely did. And the source also touches on the ongoing debate, which continues later, about the effectiveness of the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, which grew significantly from the 1950s to the 1970s in this new, much less prosperous economic context.
Right. So this decline really sets the stage for the turbulent period that follows.
Precisely. Which brings us to that third chapter. Periods of upheaval and recovery. And the first major global shock here is World War II.
Uruguay entered this as what the source calls a tumultuous period of international relations.
Yeah. Its official policy was one of strict neutrality, trying to balance allegiances, a stance kind of foreshadowed by its position during the Spanish Civil War earlier.
But that neutrality was severely tested, wasn't it?
Severely. In 1942, a German submarine was sunk near its coast, resulted in 89 deaths. German and Italian fighters were banned from its territory, and there were even reports swirling about potential pro-Axis coup attempts within Uruguay itself.
So figures within the government started pushing back?
Yes, figures like Rodriguez pushed for a stronger anti-Axis stance, demanding, for instance, that Uruguayan territory not be used by the German consulate for their activities. The source even mentions some acts of anti-German sabotage occurring.
There was a real fear articulated in the source of a resurgent Germany trying to infiltrate and conquer South America using spies and murder.
It seems so. Ultimately, Uruguay did declare war, joining the Allied side just a week after the U.S. entered the war.
The source mentions some almost symbolic events around this time, like a strange emulation of a death march, contrasting with a triumphal march.
Yeah, and a diplomatic treaty granting wide powers that, while maybe a success on paper, in the wartime reality, it basically opened up all ships in their waters to potential seizure.
Okay. After the war, we eventually moved towards a much darker period in Uruguay's modern history, the military dictatorship from 1973 to 1984.
And the source really emphasizes how unique, how jarring this was for Uruguay, specifically because of its long history of strong civic culture and democracy.
The armed forces stepped in, dissolved parliament, took control.
Yes. And the source highlights the systematic and planned nature of the human rights violations that followed, actions that were explicitly endorsed by international bodies at the time.
In the wake of the dictatorship, there have been significant efforts, right, both state-led and from civil society, to uncover the truth about victims, collect testimonies, remember the resistance.
Absolutely. But the source also points to the emergence of a powerful counter-narrative, what it terms the big lie, an ideology specifically organized to deny and silence the repression.
Where was this visible?
Very visible in things like the Official Truth Commission set up initially, and particularly in the amnesty law, known as the Ley de Caducidad, which was later declared unconstitutional by the courts.
But despite huge obstacles, the push for memory, truth, and justice began pretty much as soon as democracy returned.
It did. The legal and social aftermath of those human rights violations is incredibly complex. The source notes Uruguay had actually been a leader in human rights before the dictatorship.
That after the transition.
After the transition, laws like that Ley de Caducidad or the Ley de Impunidad, impunity law, as critics called it, which were actually passed by popular referendums in 1986 and 1989, effectively blocked prosecution for many who served under the dictatorship.
That changed later, though.
It did. The mid-1990s saw a wave of trials begin to challenge this impunity. International pressure was definitely a factor. There was a UN special rapporteur pushing the idea that states have a duty to investigate, prosecute, and punish these kinds of crimes.
And a major court ruling?
Yes. A really pivotal moment was the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruling in 2011. It basically mandated that Uruguayan courts must act on cases defined as human rights violations under international law.
Hmm.
The source notes this decision really pushed plaintiffs to move past their previous, perhaps understandable, indifference towards Uruguayan courts.
And this legal push has been coupled with a growing social movement.
Absolutely. A movement involving victims, their families, researchers, activists. They've been incredibly vocal in demanding truth, justice, compliance with international law, and the exhumation of disappeared people's remains from unmarked graves. And the source says this movement has actually sparked tangible changes within state institutions like the judicial and police systems.
The repression itself also forced many Uruguayans into exile, didn't it?
Yes, into what the source calls underground exile, finding refuge in cities like Buenos Aires, São Paulo.
And these exiles weren't just passive victims, they became actively involved.
Very active, involved in human rights protests and the crucial work of translating information about violations to get the word out to wider international audiences.
The source contrasts the radicalization some experienced in exile guerrilla movements with the situation inside Uruguay.
It does, and highlights how these exiles engaged in things like anti-plebiscite campaigns. Remember that vote the military tried to hold. Women were handing out flyers against it in Buenos Aires. Campaigns were run in Europe, generating critical press coverage.
There's a fascinating contrast highlighted there. Back home, mass firings might have generated some sympathy at work, but pro-plebiscite rallies organized by the regime in Montevideo apparently drew mass turnouts.
It's complex, and the source makes a really powerful point about how art can make it safe in the face of horror. Exiles use creative outlets, writing, directing plays, printing pamphlets, radio broadcasts, political cartoons.
As political acts of art.
Exactly, showing a kind of slyness towards the regime, finding ways to resist and communicate under difficult circumstances.
So the actual return to democracy in 1984 was initiated by a plebiscite, a vote.
Yes, ironically. A vote on whether to accept or reject a 1971 constitutional reform that the military itself had proposed, which would have entrenched their power.
The regime was aiming for an ambiguous outcome, kind of wanting to draw a curtain over the past.
Precisely. A yes vote would have cemented military prerogatives and, crucially, upheld that controversial amnesty law, the one the source critically describes as a full-stop law, designed specifically to shield torturers and murderers from prosecution.
The no vote won, and the first democratic election followed soon after.
Yes, and the source characterizes this transition as achieving an unfair but probably unavoidable new balance between trying to adhere to international human rights norms and grappling with the heavy memory of the dictatorship.
This 1985 transition, it seems, was built on something the source calls the fulfillment of the Pact of Silence.
That's a key phrase. Yes, this pact was apparently rooted in the fear, on many sides, of public knowledge about the full, harsh truths of the dictatorship, and it depended on the feigned political invisibility of the state agencies that were involved in the repression.
So the guarantees of immunity were put in place to maintain a deliberate blindness.
That's the argument, and the source suggests these were surprisingly effective, managing to prevent major fractures in this pact of silence, even as the century turned well into the 2000s.
This silence wasn't just passive, it was actively maintained.
Apparently so, through governmental actions, political maneuvering, even strategic repression at times, all aimed at deepening the political invisibility of the state criminal past in the collective memory.
It's really incredible how those historical forces, that recent past, shape the present. Let's move into contemporary Uruguay now. The material touches on the resilience of its political system.
Yeah, helped partly perhaps by its relative isolation from some of the major revolutionary movements that swept other parts of Latin America over the decades.
You see this resilience even in difficult moments, like the bitterness of that 1984 election campaign or the work of bodies like the Peace and Justice Commission later on.
And the source points to ongoing debates about current challenges, things like how the country adapts to neoliberal economic trends, the potential downsides of war on drugs policies, and even discussions around nuclear development. These are live issues.
A major political story of the modern era has definitely been the rise of the left.
Absolutely. The source notes that older political structures and selection processes essentially kept the left out of national power until the 1960s, when various parties, the Socialist Party, PS, the Communist Party, PC, the left wing of the National Party, PN, started to coalesce.
And support grew significantly later.
Yes, facing tightening economic crises in the late 90s, worsening conditions for ordinary people, and maybe limited success of traditional union struggles against neoliberal policies, support for the left grew. This culminated, of course, in the broad front, Frente Amplio, winning power.
The source connects this to a broader regional trend in the early 2000s, doesn't it?
It does. That pink tide, where leftist governments emerged across Latin America, sometimes quite unexpectedly. It sparked widespread debate about the deeper structural roots and the different policy approaches these governments took.
Okay, turning to social policies. The source highlights their fundamental importance in contemporary Uruguay, shaping welfare, security, health, education, income.
Right. Key examples mentioned include the integrated system of health, SIS, and specific emergency health policies. Also, educational policies focused on well-being and equality.
And despite some literature maybe focusing on crises, the source emphasizes that Uruguay has actually achieved a strong macroeconomic equilibrium.
Yeah, and seen a strong improvement in the standard of living, backed by data on wealth and purchasing power. And crucially, it notes that social expenditure hasn't generally been cut during economic downturns, which is significant.
Why is that? What allows for that stability?
The source attributes this stability and the ability to maintain social progress to key national strengths. Things like accumulated human capital, a high degree of professionalism in public service, talented people, and notably, negligible corruption scandals.
So relatively intact institutions.
Exactly. Seen as a valuable resource for any incoming government, and reflecting what the source calls a technocratic tradition with centrist practices.
Economically, the 21st century saw that really historic shift. The left-wing broad-front government, led by Tabaré Vázquez, coming to power in March 2003.
A huge moment. The source suggests their success came from a combination of factors: experience within their ranks, coherent policy proposals, and voters simply being ready for a change after decades of the traditional parties.
And their approach, facing social and economic problems, was based on national dialogue rather than repression.
That was the key. Formalized through things like the Social Dialogue Round and a National Development Pact writing from 2004-2010, aimed at building a new model of sustainable development.
What was the reaction from the traditional powers? The oligarchy, the media?
The source notes they kind of broke their relative silence to push a new agenda, emphasizing liberal economic practices, anti-corruption drives. Debates also intensified around things like labor organization and the public health insurance system.
Okay, let's talk agriculture. Still historically vital, obviously, but facing significant modern challenges.
Big challenges. The source describes developments like massive mega dairies that have effectively doubled the size of the dairy region. But this has involved converting traditional family farms into what it calls galaxy farms.
And leading to the expulsion of farmers.
Exactly. And this intensification has worrying environmental consequences. Things like minimal regulatory oversight, the replacement of native forests with monocultures, eucalyptus, pine issues with water security, dams, drainage, overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, and contributing to climate change.
The source makes a very strong statement here, doesn't it? Saying this path resembles the Atlantic coast jungle's plunder of centuries.
It does. And it warns explicitly that this risks potential environmental, social, and public health crises. Serious stuff.
Okay, on a potentially brighter note, tourism. It's a key part of modern Uruguay's identity and economy.
Definitely. The iconic image remains Punta de la Este's beaches, that famous postcard picture.
And while the dominant spots and seasonal patterns are maybe similar to past decades, international tourism is sustained by those strong connections to neighbors, right? Argentina and Brazil.
Very much so. But there's also real growth in other areas, things like ecotourism, adventure tourism, cultural tourism, rural tourism. They're adding depth to that traditional beach image.
The source notes 2 decades of continuous growth in tourist arrivals and spending.
Yeah. And while Argentinian and Brazilian visitors are still the majority, domestic tourism, Uruguayans traveling within Uruguay, has also grown significantly, especially between 2000 and 2010, helped by improved wealth and income domestically.
The big challenge remains seasonality, though.
Absolutely. That strong peak season from December to March, finding policies to spread demand throughout the year, is a key ongoing challenge.
Culturally, how have things evolved? The source suggests the urgent task of nation building has maybe faded somewhat.
Yeah, leading to debates now being more focused on things like foreign policy choices, relationships with neighbors, and different domestic economic development strategies. That old protectionism versus state enterprise debate is still alive, just maybe in different forms beyond pure politics.
The vision for the future, as described, involves more civil society participation.
Yes, greater participation, more cooperation across different economic sectors, and potentially an expanded, though debated, role for the state, Different ideas for development have certainly emerged since the return to democracy.
And there's been a real increase in public debate and civil society involvement generally.
Definitely. Alongside a kind of reinvention or strengthening of political institutions, more deputies, new referendum laws, establishing a dedicated budget office, an ombudsman. You see independent agencies and courts now handling cases that were probably unthinkable just a few decades ago.
The source brings up this interesting concept of a Pandora's box, though.
Yeah, this hybrid idea of IT-driven feedback and participation. It suggests this increased digital engagement can simultaneously contribute to national crises and positive institutional development. It's complex.
Like the role literature and arts played earlier in cultural identity, it's evolving in the digital age.
Exactly, a complex picture.
Okay, what about international relations? How does modern Uruguay position itself?
Well, it maintains its historical commitment to the principles of international law as a guide for foreign policy. That seems consistent.
Evident in its role as a founding member of Mercosur in 2000.
Absolutely. The Regional Economic Bloc and Customs Union. Uruguay was apparently one of the most committed members early on, playing a key role in the 1991 Framework Agreement. And was a strong advocate for pushing trade negotiations with the EU.
Even though that goal has faced internal hurdles within Mercosur itself.
Right. And they've had to adapt their foreign affairs approach at times, particularly after events like the controversial Senate vote against Venezuelan membership shifted regional dynamics.
And importantly, Uruguay has a significant, consistent role in international peacekeeping missions, the OMP.
A very significant role. They've been sending troops and personnel since way back in 1948. The source sees this not just as policy, but as a natural expression of their long-term foreign policy goals, commitment to multilateralism, collective security through the UN Security Council.
So pulling together the challenges facing modern Uruguay, what are the big ones? We see persistent economic issues.
Yeah, things like chronic low GDP per capita growth, economic volatility, some big recessions, and overall performance that tends to lag behind comparable countries in the region, coupled with inequality, which the source notes actually deteriorated in the 1990s.
And these economic struggles are intertwined with significant environmental challenges.
Absolutely. The source highlights a concerning ecological deficit. Basically, Uruguay is using resources faster than its ecosystems can regenerate them, and this trend seems to be deepening.
Driven by risks from modern agriculture, those monocultures, pollution, but also from urban development.
Yes, urban sprawl, challenges with refuse disposal, traffic congestion, and the degradation of urban ecosystems are all mentioned as contributing factors.
So reflecting on this entire journey,
Right.
from those early, almost dismissed settlements through civil war, social transformation, the darkness of dictatorship, and then recovery, Uruguay's history is anything but second-rate or simple, is it?
Not at all. It's a country with a history that's every bit as deep, as complex, as compelling as its much larger neighbors, even if it's often, less widely known.
It really is a story shaped by this unique blend of internal forces and external pressures, these enduring paradoxes, and what the source aptly describes as an unyielding spirit.
That captures it well.
You sometimes get this image presented, maybe, of a country without enemies, perhaps moving past a paranoid nationalism. But the reality we've explored today shows a nation actively grappling with deeply complex economic, environmental, and social issues just beneath that surface.
The material we've gone through truly pulls back the curtain on the layers of history, the tensions that define contemporary Uruguay. It's fascinating.
And it leaves us with a really provocative final thought to consider, doesn't it? The source suggests that Uruguay's persistent underdevelopment isn't just about the typical factors we might think of, like economic dependency or global markets.
No, it argues that a significant reason lies specifically in its failure to achieve fundamental behind-the-scenes changes in local power relations, the deep structures of power.
And maybe also how simplified or idealized images of the country, the peaceful democracy, the beaches, can actually lessen its perceived credibility on the world stage and perhaps even diminish our fascination with its true, complex reality.
It's a powerful, almost counterintuitive thought that those deeper, often hidden power structures, combined with how the country is portrayed or perceived, might themselves be core obstacles to its progress in ways we might not initially expect. Definitely something for you, the listener, to keep thinking about.